Uh, well, thank you very much. I think the title of this session was, Are You New Leaders? And I can tell you I'm definitely not. Because actually what I do is kind of partly because I didn't want to be a leader. So I got to a position in journalism where I had a kind of office on the 18th floor of Canary Wharf, and I was assistant executive deputy editor of The Independent. And you will know that if organisations don't have titles like that anymore outside the public sector, but if you got to a position like that, that meant you were in charge of chairs. Because my experience was the sort of longer my title got and the more powerful it sounded, the reality was that my job got more boring and actually I got less power because I ended up doing all this stuff, serving people to try and get them new chairs or what have you. And the further and further I got from the things that had brought me into journalism, and I spent far too much time looking at Excel spreadsheets and not enough time sort of actually thinking about news, stories, interviews, so on and so forth. And so almost 20 years ago, I left, and I left simply on a hunch. And the hunch was that if I could do interesting things, then I'd get other people interested in them, and that if you get the ideas right, the money will follow. But if you think about the money first, you're liable to go into a dead end, because actually money follows ideas. It follows people with compelling ideas which mobilize other people and they can show they can turn them into action. If you just follow the money, you end up as a work program provider thinking about whether you can actually make money on the next set of terms offered by DWP, put it crudely. So I suppose the experiment, to put it in a sort of most flattering light that I have been engaged in, other than being kind of completely selfish, has been to see if you can have influence and to some extent power without having a title. And it would just be a really good exercise for you to do, to think, if I didn't have a title, if I wasn't director of learning or head of children's services or whatever it was, why would anyone listen to me? And why would they do things that I think are the right things to do? Just assume you have no institutional power whatsoever, you've got no title, and actually you've got no resources. How would you still get people to do things that you thought were right? Because that is kind of the counterfactual that new leaders have to go through. So let me, in the sort of 10 minutes remaining, I just want to sort of suggest two sort of very simple ways of thinking about that challenge and give you one example of a team of people who rose to it. So the way of thinking is this, that we live in a world of tightening constraints, not just fiscal constraints, but environmental constraints, resource constraints, and crucially, the kind of people and businesses that you are dealing with are not going to see their income grow that much for the next 15, 20 years. This is the new normal. That basically, the kind of people we're talking about, their incomes are going to be flat. And they are going to be looking for better ways to live with incredibly modest incomes. But that does not mean that their aspirations are going to be flat. Actually, aspirations in this country are high and probably rising. So if the kind of fundamental context is tightening constraints amongst governments, businesses and consumers, but rising aspirations, that is a recipe for innovation. If it's not going to be a recipe for cutting back or lowering expectations, it has to be a recipe for innovation to meet tightening constraints and rising aspirations. That conflict, that tension has to be resolved through innovation. And the innovators that I talk about in this book, The Frugal Innovator, are people by and large in the developing world who've done that, who've met no resources, huge need for education and found ways to do it. The most inspiring example, almost without exception, is an NGO in India called Pratham, which has a price point of $10 a year to educate a child preschool. So that's another thought experiment. If you had $10 a year, how would you deliver a high-quality preschool education to hundreds of thousands of people in India? And the recipe that they have used to do that is basically that you have to tap into what is abundant. And what is abundant in this world is our capacity for collaboration. And it's becoming more abundant. Through technology and other devices and means, actually our ability to collaborate with one another, to share, combine, mobilize resources to address those challenges is going up. So, the challenge for organizations, any organization in this room, is how to try and address challenges which are shared by using collaboration, and that will mean that organizational upheaval, conflict, uncertainty, and kind of trauma is going to be absolutely normal. This is not episodic. This is going to be what it's going to be like. And so just look around you. Just think what it would be like to be in Tesco's, who has found a 250 million black hole in their accounts because they're being eaten alive by Aldi and Lidl, who everyone condescended to, but now show that they actually understood the market and they bothered to understand the consumers that they were selling to. Or think of yourself running Samsung's mobile business, where they've just announced a 60-70% drop in profits because they've been successful for 3 years, but they're being radically undercut by the Android market in India and China by people coming in with super low-cost smartphones. In other words, this kind of challenge that you feel is absolutely endemic. Every industry, people are searching for new business models, and the reason they're doing that is they're having to find new, different ways to respond to this crunch between scarce resources, rising aspirations, abundant collaboration. So if you're not up for that, it's going to be quite difficult. Unless you sell very top-end French wine, or you happen to be the Glastonbury Festival, or something like that. Unless you've got something so specific and so special, actually that's what life is going to be like. And that means for all public leaders, the kind of experience that has just been recounted on the panel is one of having to be pulled, but also to reconcile very different forces. On the one hand, how do you comply, perform, deliver? And on the other, how do you create adaptive, able communities and people who are able better to solve their own problems? How do you deliver a service to a community, but also in the process help the community to become more resilient, more adaptive, more capable? How do you run organizations which are efficient and effective and accountable and so on and so forth, but also mobilize coalitions for change? Because if it's not an FE college or an FE sector, but FE as an activity, and the activity is a distributed activity, and actually you're going to have to do more of that because distributing it is going to be more effective and more efficient, you're going to be leading not institutions, but something more like coalitions or even movements. And that's going to require a completely different kind of leadership. So I'm just going to, in the little time that remains, 5 minutes, just tell you about one group of people who I've worked with who I think exhibit some of these characteristics, the kind of characteristics needed. And it's the team of people who worked with Mike Bloomberg when he was mayor of New York for 12 years, 3 terms. And one of the things that Bloomberg did, he's a remarkable man, Mike Bloomberg, was bring together a team, a senior team of highly skilled, very maverick, largely women, highly collaborative, who took on big challenges. And if you talk to anyone in that team, they will say the period of time working for Bloomberg was a time when they achieved more than they could ever dream of in public service. And he created a kind of environment in which they could do that. And it was because he saw innovation as a sort of continuous activity, not as something episodic, not as something as disruptive, but something that you just did continually because actually the city was continuously innovating as well. And they did that in education with Joel Klein and others a wholesale transformation of New York's education system. They did it in public space and planning with the creation of the High Line, the closure of Times Square to traffic, hundreds of kilometres of bike lanes. They did it in culture with an expansion of cultural activity in New York, and they did it in health and with services for the homeless, with a remarkable woman who is probably, in ways, certainly one of the best public leaders I've ever met, Linda Gibbs, who was Deputy Mayor for Human Services. And what they had was this culture of continuously looking for better and different. And through this process that I call radical incrementalism, in the sense that they had a very big vision. Bloomberg was all about vision. He was all about challenging the status quo. He was all about challenging things that were normal and showing they were dysfunctional and arguing they should be different. But he was absolutely fascinated by detail. So you couldn't get anything past him unless you could show that you could understand the detail. And if you have big visions but don't care about the detail, then it turns into a kind of hollow promise. And the really interesting thing about Bloomberg and many of the people that he got to work for him were that they combined apparently irreconcilable things. So he was interested in big vision but cared about detail. He had a really profound sense of purpose, moral purpose, but loves data. I mean, he consumes data. One of his catchphrases is, "I believe in God and the rest of you have to bring data." He was, and that's what he expected in his team, this ability to combine difference and work in different ways. And I'm just going to show you what I think the cycle was that they went through often when they innovated. And this is drawn from talking to people across culture, education, transport, so on and so forth. The first and most important thing that they got straight was why they were doing it. So time and time again in public services, and especially in education, we know what you've got to learn, when you've got to learn it by, often how you've got to learn it, so on and so forth. We are clueless about why you're doing it, basically. The answer to why do we have to do this, sir, is often a kind of blank stare in a way. But Bloomberg, time and time again, starts with why, which is both moral purpose, it matters because he believes in equality of opportunity, but also with data. So the purpose starts with evidence and clarity about there being a need and an opportunity. So the first thing is, don't start until you know why. Start with purpose, not process. The second is, get used to learning to love data. I am not a data person. I am skeptical about data. But working with them has persuaded me of its value. They did an exercise looking at the life history of 2,000 New York teenagers, tracing everything back to when they were born, to understand the various influences that affected their school outcomes. So data counts for diagnosis, for analysis of the problem, for finding the opportunities, for setting yardsticks, for testing them, so on and so forth. All of that matters if you're going to effectively challenge normality. Flat beats vertical. In other words, if you want an organization that is going to be quick to respond, good to collaborate, then you need some centralization of decision making, but you need an enormous amount of delegation of authority and creativity to people who can make decisions. And curiosity beats creativity. So time and again, Bloomberg it does not spend a lot of money on creating things. He does encourage people to go out and look, to find bits of solutions that you might bring back. The creativity then isn't about how you assemble those solutions in your place and make them work. But by and large, being curious beats being creative. Creative is risky, expensive, and difficult to manage. Being curious has much better payoffs. He likes planning. So he loves plans. He thinks plans are important. He never funds anything unless there's a plan, but he knows that there is a limit to how far plans can go. So his mantra is plan as far as you can get, and then you have to start acting. And you have to learn as you act. And that means rapid feedback from action in the real world, not in some artificial environment, leads then to learning what works. That's something he learned from software, and he's applied to public purpose. He managed to impart an incredible sense of urgency. One of the problems with the public sector is the pervasive lack of a sense of urgency, that we've got to get things done. Let's be quick. No, let's set up a stakeholder group to discuss the framework into which we're going to create the strategic partnership, which will eventually lead to so on and so forth. So he managed to create a sense of urgency, but not a stupid sense of urgency, because he knew that some problems were going to take 10 or 20 years. So that's why I say he created this sense of long-distance sprinting. He sprinted lots of series of sort of little sprints to get a long way. That sort of combination is very, very important. And then finally, don't go it alone, because you won't achieve anything if you go it alone, because you're going to need partners. You're going to need their skills, their resources, their access to markets, their authority, so on and so forth. So the people he employed, thinking back to your pipeline question, the people he employed, I would say, were outstanding people in their field. They were both young and old. Many of them were mavericks. Many of them had been in and out of the public and the private sector. They included people like Jeanette Sadiq Khan, who was his director of transport, who was a sort of self-styled sort of guerrilla kind of leader. She kind of spent her time shaking up systems that didn't want to be shaken. But the really strong thing about all of them was their attitude and values. It was not their knowledge. It was their attitude and values. It was their willingness to challenge the status quo, and it was their willingness to look for partners that really stood out. They were fantastically good collaborators. And the lesson I would take is that I would drop the whole pipeline analogy. I think the whole pipeline analogy is way too linear, way too kind of singular. You need to be fed by a whole series of tributaries. It has to come from many, many more sources, because those skills can come from all over the place. The kind of people who exhibit that kind of leadership capacity are almost certainly going to be people with a different way of seeing the world. I'll leave it there.